to finish up this lecture by thinking about one last question. We saw in the sailboat case that something is supposed to be public information. In particular, it's supposed to be public to both Roman and Columba that the mast of the second ship is greater than 100 centimeters. But that wasn't the only thing that happened in that case. In particular, the fact that it was public was supposed to explain that they're able to coordinate in this case. They're able to both win the money in this case because they can know that they should both press the button. And precisely because it's public, in this case, that the second mast is taller than the first. The question then is, well, we saw before that common knowledge was supposed to play this important role in explaining how coordination is possible. If common knowledge isn't possible, then how does coordination happen in this case? Lederman thinks that he can actually explain what's going on in this case, though, without appeal to common knowledge. The first step is by appealing to something that we kind of actually saw when we talked about Lewis, is that when you think about it, it actually looks like only a certain kind of first order knowledge is really necessary in order to coordinate. So if Roman knows that Columba is going to play her part, if Roman knows that Columba is going to press her button, then he can press his button. But the situation is symmetric. If Columba knows that Roman is going to press his button, then she knows she should press her button as well. So if each of them can attain this knowledge of what the other person is going to do, then they should indeed press the button. That will be enough to rationalize pressing the button. So if we can explain why Roman knows that Columba is going to press, and explain why Columba knows that Roman is going to press, then Lederman thinks we're home free. Then we've explained why they're able to coordinate. And he thinks that we actually can explain what's going on here. Though he thinks how it gets explained will depend exactly on the details of the case. But one explanation he thinks of why coordination happens is simply because of induction on the basis of past cases. So for instance, they might know that whenever they played this game in the past, and they had mutual knowledge to level 4 that the second mast was taller than the first, that they pressed the button. That's something they might know that happened in every past case. Well, if they did know that, if they knew that whenever they had mutual knowledge to level 4, they coordinated because they both pressed the button, then that's an inductive reason to think, in this case, they're going to press the button. So if Roman can think, well, whenever in the past we had mutual knowledge to level 4, Columba pressed the button, that's very good reason for him to think now, in this case, that she's going to press the button. It's just a normal case of induction. And we've every reason to think that induction not only gives us justified belief, it gives us knowledge. So it looks like Roman should be able to know on the basis of induction, if something like that happened in the past, that Columba is going to press the button in this case. And similarly, the reasoning would be the same for Columba. On the basis of her past evidence, she could inductively know that Roman is going to press the button in this situation. Lederman thinks this is important because he thinks that this is what explains a lot of the coordination that actually happens. And he thinks that everybody's going to have to appeal to this. So remember when we saw in thinking about conventions, what happens with conventions is that solutions to coordination games become repeated again and again. At a certain point, we keep coordinating because we knew that we coordinated in this way in the past. And it's not clear that we need to appeal to common knowledge to explain what's going on. If, for instance, we always coordinated in the past when something was only mutual knowledge to a certain degree, well, that's good evidence for me now to think that if we have mutual knowledge to this degree, the other person is going to play their part. So he thinks in a lot of cases, the fact that we coordinated under certain circumstances in the past is exactly what's going to allow us to coordinate in this situation as well. However, you might rightly point out that that's not the only version of this situation in which they're going to coordinate. We can imagine a version of the sailboat example where they've never played this game before, but because the second mast is so obviously taller than the first one, they have no trouble in both pressing the button. And they have no problem in both doing that rationally. If that's right, well then it would seem that each person knows the other person is going to press their button, and we got to explain where does that knowledge come from, even though they've never played this game before. But Lederman thinks there is an explanation even in this case of what's going on that doesn't appeal to this really higher order knowledge in the form of common knowledge that we talked about before. And the explanation he sketches goes something like this. So first of all, he says, it's just an obvious fact in the sailboat case that the second mast is taller than the first. And it's known to be an obvious fact. Namely, you know that any ordinary person who looks at this, who looks at the second mast having seen the first, would conclude the second mast was taller, and so therefore taller than 100 centimeters. It's obvious because any normal person would conclude that. Moreover, in this situation, they know that they're jointly attending to the height of the second mast. That means they can see that each of them is sort of looking back and forth between the mast and the other person. Each person can see that the other is attending to the height of the mast, but they can also see the other person is attending to them. So they know it's obvious that the second mast is taller than 100 centimeters, and they know they're jointly attending to it. So if they both know it's obvious, and they know they're jointly attending to it, then it looks like they both know the other person knows the mast is greater than 100 centimeters. Now, they don't have this really demanding knowledge that common knowledge requires, but Roman knows that Columba knows that the mast is higher than 100 centimeters, and Columba knows that Roman knows that too. Because it's obvious that that's true of the mast, and they can see that they're jointly attending to it. The final piece of the puzzle, then, Lederman thinks, is that they also know a conditional claim. In particular, they know that if both of them know that pressing is necessary for winning the prize, when the mast is greater than 100 centimeters tall, that is, when they know the setup of the game, and they also both know that the second mast is taller, so in particular they know it's greater than 100 centimeters, then the other person will press. So they know when both people know the rules of the game, and they know the second mast is taller, then the other person is going to press. Lederman thinks both of them know this kind of conditional. But of course, if you put that conditional together with what we've already said each person knows, then we derive that both people know the other person is going to press. Because they know everybody knows the rules of the game. We've shown that they each know that the other person knows the height of the mast. Putting that together with this conditional, we get that each person knows that the other person is going to press. And we said that that's exactly that is sufficient to explain why they would coordinate here. But this doesn't appeal to the really demanding common knowledge that we talked about so far. Each person maybe knows something about what the other person knows, but we didn't assume that Roman knows things about what Columba knows about what he knows, or anything more complicated than that. The iterations of knowledge stayed relatively small in comparison to what common knowledge would require. So this then would be an explanation of how they coordinate, which doesn't require past experience, and which also apparently is supposed to not require common knowledge. There is a question, though, obviously, of where this conditional claim comes from, and why we should think that they both know that claim. The other two are kind of relatively straightforward. I think we can grant that it is indeed obvious the second mast is taller, and that they do both know that they're jointly attending to the second mast. This conditional claim, though, definitely looks a little bit more demanding. And I think that one suspicion that people who like common knowledge would have is that maybe it's hard to know conditional like that without also having common knowledge. So maybe we haven't written common knowledge explicitly into the example. But if there was some way of resisting the sailboat example, I think probably what the defenders of the common knowledge view would say is that actually it's just a consequence of knowing the conditional that you have the kind of common knowledge we talked about. That only people who had common knowledge that the second mast was greater than 100 centimeters would also know this kind of conditional claim.